Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a podcast and video, or both of those things, where we talk about designing better miniature games. Now, I'm Mike, he's Glenn, and if you can see us, then that must mean that we're discussing line of sight.
Yes, indeed.
So line of sight is, in my opinion, a necessary evil. I don't like it. I don't like writing rules for it. I don't like that I have to deal with it as a games designer. But unfortunately, when two in or more individuals sit down to try and find out whether one toy soldier can shoot another toy soldier, inevitably the question of whether there's anything in the way and whether they can actually see comes up. And it really is... well, I mean, I've got my kind of ways of dealing with this demon, but I guess what we'll do is we'll talk about some of the ways that you can deal with this nonsense, some of the ways that we prefer to deal with this nonsense, and then maybe some of the problems that you run into as you try and define line of sight and work it through all of your systems.
Cool. So I suppose the two big boys, I guess the two main splits that line of sight comes down to is true line of sight or abstracted line of sight. And maybe we'll take a minute talking about each of them, talk about the pros and cons of them. Let's start by talking about true line of sight. So for anybody who isn't aware, true line of sight is where you have a miniature on a table with some terrain in between it and another miniature. You pick a point from which miniature A is meant to be able to see from, let's say its head. You get down to table level where your eyeball is lined up with the head
Carefully.
of miniature A. You peer that from that perspective, and then you see if you can see a sufficient amount of miniature B to do to miniature B whatever it is that you wanted to do with miniature A. I think that's a fairly reasonable sort of definition of
you're just trying to as close as is gentlemanly possible replicate what it is that the literal eyeballs of the little model can probably see, and then make some sort of reasonable judgments about whether that waving banner or that elbow that's up in a exciting position is actually part of what would be legitimately seen or not seen. And therein lies your first thing.
That's the first big con, I think, isn't it, of true line of sight as opposed to the pros.
Right, and so I guess just to catch on, one of the places before we define abstract line of sight, one of the places where somebody has tried to solve that is in Infinity, where they use a can of tomatoes, a baked bean can, so that if you can see anything inside the virtual baked bean can description of a column of space that's as high as the model, then we assume that the flailing limbs and whipping hair are in some way shootable. So that's one way of dealing with it that almost nobody else bothers with, because what a massive...
It's that's somewhere between true and abstract. That's the interesting.
Somebody who desperately wants an abstract line of sight system, but
doesn't. So I mean, because we haven't sort of pinned down what's being talked about there, if people aren't aware. Obviously, if you've got a miniature, you want to fiddle around with it, convert it, make it look really cool on the battlefield. You then want to have it holding a big banner or in a flamboyant pose, or having an extra, like, maybe model on some hair that's flowing out from it in a Mohican or something. With true line of sight, those all become actual tactical disadvantages within the game. You're being punished.
Or they become social problems to deal with, which is more spicy.
Yeah. And that's one of the other big cons of true line of sight. But so the first point I think there is that it means that your creativity as a modeler potentially hamstrings you tactically within the game, and that's a bad thing to do to people. People like modeling, they like having flamboyant models.
We'll keep a score in this part of the screen about how many reasons we come up with. But that's an important one. It weirdly ties together your creativity as a modeler with the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of that unit on the table.
And that is generally a bad idea. I would say that the pro of true line of sight, and we'll see if we can come up with a second one, but I think the main pro of true line of sight is it's really kind of easy to write. It saves you
very simple.
it's really easy for a rules writer to just go, look,
Can you see more
if
than
you can
50%
see
of the model? Then you can see it in open cover. Yeah.
and I struggled to think of a second pro to it, but definitely it's really easy to write it. You save yourself a lot of time. So
Well,
the second
the other pro is if the two players are not worried about it, then it can be a very freeing social contract where you just look at them and you go, yeah, it looks roughly right. But you have to have two players that really like each other and really know each other well, and broadly speaking, don't really care whether that model can see the other one or not. And are just happy to sort of crack on with it, because the act of doing, and we haven't defined it yet, so the act of doing, the act of measuring abstract line of sight. So let's talk about abstract line of sight. So abstract line of sight is if you take the set of models on the table, and this mostly works best with bases, and then you sort of turn them into geometric puzzles. So you sort of turn your models around and say, I've got two circles. Can I draw a line from one circle to another? And if I do draw a line from one circle to another, do they pass through some terrain? And then you can just use that drawing of a line or some lines to figure out what the line of sight is. And you never had to get down and look at the actual composition of the sort of three-dimensional space. You just measure that. And the act of getting a tape measure out and fiddling about and finding out what those lines are, like, that can be off-putting to some people, and they feel like that's that's introducing a sort of tactical heads-up display over the battlefield, which they would rather ignore and say, can my little wizard see the other little wizard? Great.
And I think, so to sort of track back a weeny bit in relation to true line of sight, one of the other big cons of true line of sight is, like you say, it requires a certain social contract. It does require people to be fairly reasonable about the situation, because I mean, one of the things is, obviously you can't get down to the eye level of your model and see what it can see, because its head is in the way of your eyeball.
There's a literal problem there.
Yeah, there's a literal actual thing you can't actually.
And we're being a bit facetious about this, but I guess that it's sort of it's symptomatic of an inaccuracy which just creates the space for arguments. And
I mean,
as I think we've talked about before, like we're quite keen on creating, if not the tightest rule sets in the world, like just rule sets that allow people to contract towards fun more easily than towards arguments.
I mean, that's the thing. I honestly, I don't think that that's a facetious problem. The fact that you can't literally, because it opens up the point where the nature of the angle and the nature of eyes, the nature of the fact that you've got two eyes in your head that are wider apart than most miniatures. So squinting from one eye to another, it genuinely creates a situation where one person doesn't think the thing can be seen and the other person does, and they're not.
And the other thing is that perspective is really weird, and what looks like a straight line between 2 points from one point massively high above the table, when you're at it from a completely different angle, just looks bizarrely different. And that, I think, is also something that seems obvious when you made a tactical choice earlier in the movement stage, for example, and then you get to a shooting phase and you're like, well, when I was stood over there peering over whilst drinking my tea, it looked absolutely like a headline of sight. Well, that's just perspective playing tricks on you.
Yeah, I know, and I've played games where somebody said, okay, can this see that other thing? I say, no, it can't. But you had tons of movement to get to a position where you can. So if you want to put it where it can, I'll let you do that now. And I actually did that on Warhammer Fantasy Battle Grand Tournament third table at the final of the tournament. We were playing, and the guy was like, "Can I see here?" I was like, "No, you definitely can't." But you had plenty of movement to be in the position where you can. So if you want to push yourself a couple of extra inches in that direction, I'll let you have the shot, because you could do it, and I know you meant to do it. And what's the point in my going, well, you didn't happen to double? It's like, no, you can, you could. I know it was within your power to do it. You're not an idiot. This is obviously what you're planning. Put it in the right position, and we'll have it pan out properly. And I think that's the thing. True line of sight does require a social contract, and it's not rules free either, because of that whole thing of what percentage of a model counts for being seeable, for being hittable It's okay.
Well, that and that I suppose is what that's the place where my irritation with true line of sight turns into actual like
Boiling rage.
rejection, is that when a shooting system has a cover system that says, if 25% or more of the model is obscured, then it's -1, and if it's 50% it's -2, or if 75% it's -3, whatever, like whatever combination of those perfectly reasonable sounding rules when you write them down as a games designer, like it's absolutely impossible to resolve that at the table. It's literally impossible to resolve that at a table. Like, depending on the microscopic angle with which I change the like literally theoretical camera of the eyeball, it's going to hugely swing what that is. And I haven't even at that point agreed whether or not we're talking about the literal cover, like entire space of the model, and like what do its arms count for? Like, they're quite spindly. Is that just like 2% of the body? Are we just talking about the body? Are we talking about the whole can of beans kind of volume that they take up? It's just like, what it requires you to do is basically make up the rules at the table. You may as well have not written those rules, because what you are saying to the players at the table is there's no way of resolving the situation within the framework of the rules. Imagine that some cover is -1 and more cover is -2. You guys just make that up at the table, because there's literally no way of you determining that from the rules. And I just think it's both a missed opportunity, and it's also just disingenuous to the players, because given the wrong pairing of players, it will create a non-fun experience, and it didn't need to. It could have just said something different.
So yes. So in between, so I think that's true line of sight, in a can. In between moving on to talking about abstract line of sight, let's take a few seconds to talk about terrain in relation to line of sight. So again, I think in relation to terrain, in relation to movement, there's a handful of standardized rules for terrain and line of sight. They are related to terrain as cover, because there are two ever so slightly different things. So terrain will either be blocking of sight or clear, or sometimes you'll have a midpoint between the two. So there's a brick wall, you can't see through the brick wall. There's a window, you can see through the window, even if it's filled with bulletproof glass. And then there's a hedge, it's a bit of tree foliage, you can see through it, but you can it tends to be see up to X inches through the tree foliage,
which I always quite liked. I always felt that was quite descriptive of the Robin Hood emerging from the woodlands.
Yeah, or you can see through it, but you are at a -X to hit. And and there's variations of sometimes it's you get a -X to hit for every inch that you're shooting through the forest. So if you are Robin Hood, you can shoot through the entire forest because you're that good at hitting, or Legolas or whatever. Whereas if you're an orc or something, you could probably only shoot through a thin hedge. And then, or as that rolls into cover, things are either hard cover or soft cover. And it's the classic, okay, a brick wall, not only can you not see the person, you can't hurt them as well. So you get a minus to hit and you get a minus to damage. With the hedge, you can't see them, but if you do hit them, the hedge is going to do nothing to impede the progress of the bullet. Bulletproof glass, you can see them very easily, but you probably can't actually hurt them. And then a combination of those things then give you all of your terrain and with the terrain rules of the previous video, movement, line of sight, and cover for terrain.
Yeah. So once you've written those once, never have to write them again.
Right. Yeah. Write them once, put them into a Word document somewhere, and every time you're writing a skirmish game, cut, paste, job done. I've got one on my website. There's a blog. Steal them. Feel free.
Yeah. They're literally of no value to us. They are not.
No. It's don't keep rewriting this. These are pretty generic rules.
So now, what's fun about cover rules?
Okay. What is fun about cover rules?
What's fun about cover rules is that you don't necessarily need them. So Gaslands does have a cover rule, but it's incredibly perfunctory, and I only included it because people kept expecting it to be there, and that's perfectly fine. Like, that's their lookout. I actually don't play with the cover rules. I can't be bothered. I don't think it's got anything to do with why I like Gaslands, but it's in there so that if if there are some barrels in between you and the other car, then there's a -1. And it doesn't interact super well with the combat system. That's how little I care about it. And for Billion Suns, I just didn't put any cover rules in because space and science fiction targeting devices and stuff. And because the combat system is interesting and intricate enough without the necessity of modifiers. And in fact, in that case, cover modifiers might have done some bizarre things that I couldn't be bothered to design around. So I think that one thing that's worth saying about cover is you don't necessarily need terrain, line of sight cover rules if that isn't what is interesting about your game. And it's possibly as interesting to think about how the model is moving rather than what is the model currently obscured by, particularly because I think that a common I'm not going to say a misconception, but a common conception of miniature skirmishes games is they are snapshots of moments of time where game state is X, some stuff happens, game state is Y, and the only times that you can interact with those models are in game state X or game state Y. And I think that particularly Infinity opened my eyes to the idea that actually it's a fluid progression of time and things can occur through any of the sort of real world cinematic moments in that experience. And with Gaslands, that was very much, there's a bunch of slightly odd when you first encounter them rules, which are basically rooted in that premise, which is there are multiple vehicles all moving simultaneously, all with their own kind of direction and momentum. And sometimes things that if you take an XY game state snapshot view look a bit weird, it's because the thing that's supposed to happen hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen in the next gear phase, or the fact that they're both moving changes the thing, even though I was the only one that, like, I drove into you, but remember we're both moving. So I do think that, all of that comes into play, which is it's worth thinking, is my game more about people running around or things driving around than it is about, hiding behind a brick wall? And if it is about hiding behind a brick wall, like, make that awesome as well.
No, absolutely. And I think this is something that is worth sort of putting out there and saying is, we're slightly dismissive of the idea of some of these generic set rules. And I think part of that, I think part of the reason that we sort of half laugh about it there is that if your game doesn't need it, don't write it because you haven't written one yet. Don't write a cover system because you've never written a cover system, and it's the first time you've answered this particular set of intellectual puzzles for yourself, and so you're quite excited to answer them, and so you figure it out, and you get some.
I mean, if you're dealing with a set of soldiers and they're all armed with guns and they're in an urban situation, like, one of the most interesting things that you can manipulate is, as I am moving, am I getting cover or getting out of cover? And that's why games like Necromunda and Infinity care so much about it, because that's what is interesting. But if in A Billion Suns the exciting thing is, am I landing in somebody's passive arc, or am I near enough to scan the container to find out what's in it, then there are other things that are interesting. And in fact, even in that modern combat, like, it might be more interesting to know, am I within the fallen guy that needs a medipack, or am I near the control panel so I can hack the door open? Like, those might be interesting questions, and if those are the interesting questions, then focus on those.
Totally. And I think this is the point sometimes, is that you look at a skirmish game and you okay, I've got to have terrain rules for movement, and I've got to have terrain rules for line of sight, and I've got to have terrain rules for cover, because that's what you have in this sort of game. And given that I've got to have terrain rules for cover, and that's just a given because I'm writing this kind of game, I'm going to write it so that it's like there's a different rule for if you're shooting for a chain link fence as opposed to a hedge, and there's going to be a different, and it's like, are there going to be chain link fences and hedges in your game? I don't know, but I'm going to write 50 different things, and you don't need any of these rules. And with all the will in the world, the basic version of them isn't a particularly interesting thing to have written. They are out there. I feel like they should be more thought of as the sort of generic building blocks of certain other games. It's like, don't rewrite basic cover rules. Just they're not. You don't need to reinvent that wheel.
Yeah, unless your game is actually about it. And I'm sure
Hmm.
there are some games, like I'm thinking, like if you wrote a sort of paintball skirmish game where the specific material mattered about whether or not you could sort of sneak a shot through someone,
Hmm.
or or it's more of like yeah, and like I'm sure
Yeah.
there are situations where intricate cover rules matter, but I suppose that cuts to that point of um designing enough of a game to support the things that are critical to that game, like
Hmm.
what are the parts of the game that you're interested in.
Yeah.
And then if some part of the movement phase or the shooting phase is not offering enough interesting questions, then the answer might be you need some more intricate rules around
Yeah.
cover or line of sight.
Yeah.
But it might not be, it might be something else entirely.
Yeah.
Just interestingly, because I've been messing around with something. So I've been messing around with drifting the Billion Suns system, because I've been painting some epic 40k tanks recently, and so sort of started pushing them around and was like, oh, I wonder if you could play epic ground battles using a Billion Suns. And interestingly, what happened the second I put them on the table was I wanted to know what the cover rules were, because if I was in some entrenchments, or if I was behind some woods, or if I was like in a rocky outcrop, like suddenly I cared about whether those tanks or walkers or whatever were in cover,
Hmm.
versus exactly the same rule system, but it was in space, and I
Hmm.
absolutely didn't care about that. So
Yeah.
I do think that there are expectations and descriptors which hang off of having these rule systems in, and
Hmm.
by not putting them in, you are saying something about the abstract nature of your game, which
Yeah.
in the abstracts of space, like that is perfect and it says something, and when we're back on the grubby sandy ground, then it needs to say something different. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Write the rules that your game needs to have in them. Don't write the rules because you haven't written those rules yet.
Mm.
I've written those rules. You can have them. Don't do it just because you haven't done it yet. Do it because it needs to be done, and do it because it's right for your game. So to track a ways back, abstract line of sight. So abstract line of sight, as Mike was saying earlier, is where you've got two miniatures and you trace a theoretical line between the two, and you then have a set of rules that pertain to the stuff between those miniatures, and you look up in a set of rules as to whether or not the two things have line of sight to each other. It's not hopefully based on anyone's opinion as to whether they can see or not. It's based out on a sort of, okay, miniature one is on terrain defined as being height X. It has a wall between it that is defined as being blocking and of height Y,
Mm-hmm.
and the other miniature. Ergo, although I think with my peeper I can see the other miniature from eyeball level, doesn't matter. We said that wall was height 5. We said that building was height 4. I'm on the building that's height 4. Ergo, I can't see the guy that's behind the wall that's height 5.
Yep.
It hopefully should mean that you don't get so many personal arguments, other than about the actual definitions of the rules, which is a whole other thing. But you don't ever have to have somebody saying, I honestly, by my eyeball, think that I can see the chest of your guy, and the other guy saying, "Well, I just don't think you can.
Mm.
There's a wall in the way." Um, the immediate, obviously, the big con, and it's not a nothing, is they take a lot of writing. You've got to define all the terrain out in more specific ways. You've got to define the way the line of sight works, and as
They
we were
take
mentioning.
more writing. Yeah, I mean, it's not beyond the wit of man.
No, but I think they take more. They take more pages. They take more volume of rules, and ergo, they take more patience
Although
on
I
the
think I
part.
think this is one of those sections of war game design where a diagram is about 600 times better than a paragraph of rules. Although you
And
sadly have to have both normally.
as Mike was alluding to earlier, when you come across 3D terrain and miniatures on top of 3D terrain,
Don't do it.
and so the obvious thing is you've got a miniature on the ground here, you've got a wall there, and you've got a miniature on the building there. Can they see each other? And so where does this work? So miniature stood on the edge of the building can presumably see straight down. If he stood like an inch back? Can he see through the corner of that building? How far along to the edge of the ledge does he have to be before the abstract rules say you can see through? And then his line of sight is going through, and the miniature stood here next to the wall. Well, you definitely shouldn't be able to see him. Miniature stood there. Well, you can probably see him. Miniature stood here, there. Oh, and if your wall does that, oh well, oh, what are we gonna do now, lads? And it's that's where your abstract rules end up start being crunchy and fiddly and gritty to write, where you're sort of, okay, I've got buildings of various heights. I've got a model stood at a window of a building looking over a wall, and another miniature stood behind a crate. Oh, write a set of abstract rules for that then,
Mhm.
Yeah, that's that. What do you think of that, Mike?
So I think that once you've got the drawing lines between circles thing to hang on to, then you do have to add a few extra bits and pieces about. You basically have to have a terrain definition about whether or not something can be seen past. And I think at that point, abstract line of sight works much better in a sort of everything's roughly the same size, because you can say things like that pile of crates is obscuring but not blocking, even though to a mouse it's blocking, and to a giant walking robot of death it's probably non-existent. But to most things in the system it's obscuring. And so I can say, well, a window is obscuring and a crate is obscuring, and if I can draw a line between two boxes and the only things that they pass through are obscuring things, then I have to come up with a rule about whether obscuring things stack, of course. But
Sure.
in general, you can deal with it in that way. The ledges and lips problem I really struggle with, and I think that the only skirmish games that I've written that have little round basted models, I basically just play them in 2 dimensions. And obviously Gaslands is a very 2-dimensional game, and A Billion Suns is oddly a very 2-dimensional game, even though it's got other elements that pull it sideways. And so I think that it's weird because I grew up playing Necromunda on that beautiful 3-dimensional terrain with the multiple levels. And in many regards, that is why true line of sight exists. Like, it's a way of just saying, oh, this is too hard, just have a little look.
Yeah, because I think that's the thing. The rules for abstract line of sight, like you say, yes, a bunch of man-sized minis at ground level. Abstract line of sight is just lovely. It solves so many problems in your life. Put multiple level buildings, put different height miniatures, and you start entering into a headache. And what I say is, those rules aren't impossible to write. They're not even a lot of the time super difficult to write, but they're extremely hard to write in a smooth, elegant fashion, in a way where everybody will read those rules once, understand them, and more importantly, remember them at the tabletop.
Yeah.
That is incredibly hard for writing abstract line of sight rules over multiple heights.
A classic example of this is Malifaux, which had in 2nd edition some very cryptic rules about when people were stood on buildings and what shadow the building cast. And literally everyone just played Malifaux on 2-dimensional tables because it was too hard.
Absolutely. I totally I remember those rules where it's sort of, okay, there's something to do with the how tall your model is and how far away from you are from the edge, and a guy stood too close to the building you can't see, and too far away from the building you can't see, but if he's just in the Goldilocks zone,
oddly there is a very elegant sort of echo of this in Adeptus Titanicus, the most recent one, where it has true line of sight and you have to peer down the barrel of each individual weapon to find out what the Titan can shoot at. But they also have missile launchers on their back. And there's a little rule in that, which is Titans cast a shadow equal to their scale. So I think big Titans are like scale 8, scale 10. And what it means is that anyone within a 10-inch bubble can't be shot by the big missile launchers that are on the top, because essentially they can't point downwards. And it's kind of awesome. Like, it's just a little flavorful thing that's dropped in there. But I think like it's a funny little expression of that. And I suppose in that context, because it's quite minor, it's easy to remember and easy to understand. And then how do you then map that onto every available rock crag and half-finished building, and ruined church with a minor hole in its floor, and yeah, it's a nightmare.
So I guess possibly to sort of round up, true line of sight.
Yeah, I mean the question is, just before you round up on that, the question is, if true line of sight is so good for 3-dimensional ruined spaces like Necromunda, but abstract line of sight is incredibly more resolvable in almost every other situation, then I suppose the question is, what is your game most likely to provide? Like, what are you telling people is the normal setup? Because that, I think, is worth thinking about. If you're inspiring them to play in a flat space, then use abstract line of sight. If you are, in your illustrations and your photographs and the way that you describe the game, saying to them this is a very 3-dimensional line, then I think even I might start to consider true line of sight.
I think possibly. I think the other question is, because there is a question about what sort of game it is, where it's sort of, okay, one of the things about Necromunda is it's a little bit more a characterful game. It's a little bit more not role play, but you're meant to identify with your guys, and you're meant to be like, oh, we're running through this building, being shot at, and oh no, Jimmy's just gone down. Whereas if you're playing a game that is a bit more crunchy and a bit more sort of, I really want to know, if I can see him according to a set of sort of clean, sharp rules. I guess what I would say is, what amount of cost are you willing to pay to get those clean, sharp rules into the game? And if you're playing a game that's everyone is the same height and everyone's on a flat surface, it's really cheap to get those very clean rules into your game. So kind of, why not just pay that very cheap price? As you put in more buildings, as you differ your heights, that cost is going to get exponentially more and more expensive for your players' complexity budget and your own sanity to a degree. And you've got to start asking, am I still willing to pay that price? Is it going to pay back sufficiently in fun to a certain given a value of fun for the people playing my game? And if the answer eventually gets to a point where you have to say, you know what, no, I'm not writing a game that precise anyway, I don't want people to be put through that pain.
Yeah.
Drop it out, go for true line of sight.
Yeah,
if you're going,
I mean, like, case in point with that is A Billion Suns, where you've already got a ton of questions that you're having to manage, lots of things you've got to think about in terms of where your ships are and what resources they're going after and what all these contracts mean. Like, if there was a set of interacting rules about whether or not ships are blocking view to each other, to another ship, like it would introduce a bunch of other complexities that I'd have to think about as I was moving, that it would drag it back from being a complex, delightful tactical challenge into just being like a slog, and you didn't want it.
Whereas if you're writing, I don't know, Sniper Elite, the game, where whether or not your guy who belly shuffles up to the edge of a skyscraper can see this dude, hiding behind a mailbox, is basically the whole game, then then get into that, write the rule set for an abstract line of sight.
Because maybe he can shoot directly down, but he's really unstable at that point.
But if that's what your game's about, and if the price of that complexity budget is worth paying, crack on and write it. Don't just go, it's too expensive, mentally, let's just have true line of sight. Just think a little bit about what your game really is and how it pays off, and what the experience, as I think we keep harking back to, is what is the experience for your players, what's the experience you're aiming for, and figure out how that's meant to work for you. So any final thoughts on line of sight and terrain from Mr. Mike?
No, I think we've flogged through that hedge sufficiently.
Okie dokie. So we'll sign off on this video. Where have you found this? There will be a comment section somewhere down there. Let us know what you think and what you'd like us to talk about in the future. If you're watching this as a video, it is available as a podcast for longer painting sessions. If you're on the podcast, check out our faces on YouTube. Reach out to us on Twitter or any other social media. But until next time, it's goodbye for now. Bye.
Bye.